Primary text for this presentation is Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley, and I'll be looking at it in relation to Harriet Eustace's article, Responsible Creativity and the Modernity of Mary Shelley's Prometheus. I'll present this video in three parts. In the first part, I'll provide a quick overview of the article. Secondly, I'll focus on what claims Eustace is putting forward and what perspectives they offer to an analysis of Frankenstein. And lastly, I'll critique its usefulness and bring attention to ways in which it feels either limited or incomplete. So Eustace jumps straight in by noting key themes within Shelley's text, such as the issue of paternal negligence, patriarchal authority and injustice, and the responsibility of a creator to their progeny. Further along, she addresses other issues less anchored to the text, such as the inadequacies of objective justice and the moral issues regarding responsibility as a debt or an obligation. So it might not come as a shock that the main argument Eustace is making with this text is in the title itself. But what she means exactly by responsible creativity is a little less obvious. But first we should ask the question, who even is Prometheus? So Prometheus was this guy, a titan who stole fire from the heavens to give to the humans, and then probably came to regret it. This fire saga has been at the forefront of the Promethean myth and often overshadows the part where he created mankind out of clay or mud, depending which Promethean text you're reading. And this is the aspect of the myth from which Shelley drew inspiration for Frankenstein. Victor, as Christopher Small put it, as the maker of man, and the very reason Harold Bloom used to justify Shelley as inferior to her male romantic contemporaries. But what Eustace says that Small and Harold Bloom are forfeiting by adhering to such a limited perspective is the entirety of the point and quality of Shelley's modernization. While I agree with this sentiment in respect to Small, I cannot agree with her critique of Bloom's anti-romantic reading, which I will address later in part 3. By focusing on the creation element of the Promethean myth, Shelley is able to really unpack the themes of paternal negligence, patriarchal authority, and the offspring's reliance upon their creator stepping into their responsibilities. Eustace asserts that it is only by paralleling these stories that Shelley can fully illuminate their divergence, which ultimately boils down to sensibility, or Prometheus's willingness to sacrifice himself for the sake of his creation, versus objective principles of justice, i.e. Frankenstein's flitting between resigning to obligation and complete abandonment. Frankenstein writes, quote, "I concluded that the justice due both to him and my fellow creatures demanded of me that I should comply with his request," end quote, and then once again ends up abandoning the creation of a mate for his monster. It is in Frankenstein's inability to sympathize with and desire to be rid of his creation that Eustace refers to Carol Gilligan's analysis of the moral and psychological development of women and draws parallels between Frankenstein's monster and an unwanted pregnancy. However, Eustace doesn't develop this argument much further, likely due to sensitivity issues or simply for the sake of throwing a banal crumb of feminism into the mix somewhere. This makes for a good segue into the third part of this presentation, a critique of the article's usefulness. First of which, I'd like to address the previous slide and note that while I get where she's coming from, the metaphor doesn't quite land since an unwanted pregnancy is unwanted, and Frankenstein very much wanted his creation until he realized he properly screwed it up. But let's go back to her claim about sensibility versus objective principles of justice and unpack that some more. On the moral shortcomings of objective justice, Eustace writes, quote, "They cannot adequately, i.e. sympathetically, assess the responsibilities of a creator for the life he creates," end quote. In this, I see two main issues, one being the black and white nature of this perspective, and two, its incompletion by lack of resolution. One guy who would reject Eustace's claim is Nietzsche, who regarded pity as condescension, but this slide is mostly just satisfying my desire to mention Nietzsche anywhere possible, so on this black and white perspective of objective justice, Eustace is limiting the practice of creative responsibility to the creation solely. She limits creative responsibility to the creation rather than for the creation. By this I mean that she is rejecting the notion of Frankenstein engaging in any kind of creative responsibility on the basis that he does not extend his sympathies towards his monster, despite Victor acknowledging the effect that his creation could have upon the rest of humanity. It is the way of responsibility towards humanity for his creation that one could argue that he does in fact pursue. So what this leads to by the end is an incomplete thesis. If you can't sympathize with your creation, you suck. If you take responsibility for your creation without extending it towards the creation, you suck. And if you try to compensate for this lack of sensibility via an objective assessment of morality, you still suck. And we just end up feeling like Prometheus being strapped to the side of a cliff, damned if we do, damned if we don't. Yet somehow all of this is supposed to refute Harold Bloom's reading of Frankenstein as an anti-romantic text on the grounds of an antagonistic Promethean pity, despite providing no real answer to how a creator should consider their responsibilities, if they aren't an obligation, a debt to be paid, or a duty to be fulfilled. I will conclude by returning to a much earlier question of who is Prometheus, but this time with an intonation shift to who is Prometheus. If we think of Prometheus, as we're guided to, as a maker of man, then he's Frankenstein. If we think of Prometheus as he who sacrifices himself for the collective, he's Frankenstein. But if we think of Prometheus as one who steals and provides for those he pities, the creature becomes Prometheus. And if we think of Prometheus as he who does good only to be persecuted, Prometheus again becomes the creature. Thus, Eustace's critique of Harold Bloom's reading of Frankenstein as anti-romantic and anti-sensibility cannot be entirely refuted when the novel's main allegorical figure is found embodied within both its protagonist and antagonist, who simultaneously are and aren't Prometheus, and whose Promethean qualities are not fixed but fluid. It is in this vein that a reader might benefit from reading Frankenstein as neither pro nor anti anything, but as a text grappling with the explosion of new binary oppositions where nothing could be so clear-cut, black or white. Thank you for your indulgence.